In this series, we're talking about world religions, not the details of each particular religion you could find all around the world, but we're looking at some of the big picture characteristics that divide the world religions into basic kind of categories or groupings. And fundamentally, that's defined by how people think about God. So in week 1, we talked about theism, which is the belief in one or more gods, in beings that are distinct and separate from human beings. And then in week 2, we talked about pantheism. Pantheism is the idea that everything is part of God, or everything that exists is an expression of God's reality. And then today we're going to talk about atheism. Atheism is the belief that there really are no gods. Now, there is such a thing as religious atheism. Now, that may sound strange to say that, but I'm talking about spiritual systems of belief that really don't posit a personal deity. For example, some forms of Buddhism are atheistic because they believe that everyone and everything is just part of some big universal whole, but it's not theistic because that whole is not conceived of as a being or some kind of a personal entity, so it's not called a god. So hence that it's an atheistic form of religion. But what we're probably more familiar with is naturalistic atheism. Naturalism is a philosophy that the only things that exist are what you can see in the natural world, in the natural universe. That it doesn't exist unless you can measure it and quantify it and test it. So there's no gods, no spirits, no demons, no angels, nothing like that. The only things that exist are things that can be sensed or touched. Even the atom can be measured. Light, photon particles can be measured in some way or the other. So they exist even though we can't see them with our natural eyes. They exist because they can be tested and evaluated. That's naturalistic atheism. But let's see, what does the Bible say about atheism? Let's take a look. And the first thing that we see, the Bible consistently affirms God's existence. See, the Bible starts in Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 with the assumption that God is real. It says, in the beginning, God created. So it starts with the premise of God, and the Bible never tries to prove that God exists. It simply shows God actively involved in the creation and the history of the world. And so the basic worldview of the whole Bible would rule out the possibility of atheism. Secondly, the Bible teaches that not every God is real. There's only one God who actually exists, and all the gods of the nations around Israel were not real. They were just figments of human imagination, things that people had made up to worship, but there's only one God who's really real. We see this in Isaiah. The prophet says, "How foolish are those who manufacture idols. These prized objects are really worthless. The people who worship idols don't know this, so they are all put to shame. Who but a fool would make his own god, an idol that cannot help him one bit? Then the wood carver measures a block of wood and draws a pattern on it. He works with chisel and plane and carves it into a human figure. He gives it a human beauty and puts it in a little shrine. He burns part of the tree to roast his meal and to keep himself warm. He says, 'Ah, that fire feels good.' Then he takes what's left and makes his god, a carved idol. He falls down in front of it, worshiping and praying to it. 'Rescue me,' he says, 'you're my God.' Such stupidity and ignorance, their eyes are closed and they cannot see, their minds are shut and they cannot think." And so the prophet is pointing out the absurdity of worshiping things that we've made with our own hands. You take a tree and you burn part of it in the fire and the rest you shape into an idol and bow down before it. That's crazy. That God doesn't really exist. There's really only one God who does exist. Then we see that God's existence is clear from the universe that He's made. The biblical position is that you can look at the universe, you can look at creation from the expanse of the heavens far above us to the intricacies of the cell and of the atom in the microscopic level. You can look at all of that and it tells us that God has created it. It testifies to us that God really does exist. There's no other explanation for the existence of the universe. And Romans chapter 1 points this out. They know the truth about God because He has made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see His invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God. Yes, they knew God, but they wouldn't worship Him as God or even give Him thanks. And they began to think up foolish ideas of what God was like. As a result, their minds became dark and confused. Claiming to be wise, they instead became utter fools. And instead of worshiping the glorious, ever-living God, they worshiped idols made to look like mere people and birds and animals and reptiles. Romans chapter 1 tells us that people have suppressed this understanding of God, that people have looked at creation and decided to ignore the truth or deny the truth, and they've created for themselves gods of their own making, or they've decided to worship no gods at all, and that this was an act of moral and spiritual darkness on the part of human beings. And so atheism is a form of moral and spiritual folly. We see this in Psalm chapter 14. It says, "Only fools say in their heart, there is no God." When it says that atheists are fools, it's not talking about intellectually. Atheists can be very intelligent. They're not stupid. But the way that this word is used in the Bible, it speaks of moral and spiritual folly, our moral and spiritual condition. And the fact is that a lot of atheists are driven by a desire to be free from moral authority. And so it says it's spiritually foolish to reject the idea of God or to deny the evidence for God just out of a desire to be free from the laws of God or from the truth of God. So here's what the Bible says about atheism. The Bible does reject the existence of many gods, those gods who are created by the human imagination. But there is one God who's real, the God that's revealed to us in the Bible, the God who is the creator of all things.